And my name is Erik Molvar. I'm the Executive Director of Western Watersheds Project. I'm a wildlife biologist, and my studies are in moose ecology and herbivory. And I am also the author of 17 guidebooks to Western public lands. And now at the helm of Western Watersheds Project for 5 years, the organization focuses on protecting and restoring wildlife and watersheds throughout the American West, with a special focus on livestock grazing issues. And I'll go ahead and start with my first slide here. And the title of my talk was originally A History of Domestic Terrorism in the American West, but now it's changed to a brief history because there's so much to talk about here. And one of the things I want you to notice here about this first slide, this is an actual sticker that's for sale to folks of this philosophical ilk. And you see a Confederate flag underlaid over the Gadsden flag, which is the "Don't Tread on Me" symbology. This is going back to the Revolutionary War, this flag, but of course the Confederate battle flag is the flag of insurrection against the federal government. And so this overlays two different pieces of American history that are now being brought to the fore by this domestic terrorism movement in the American West. And I use the words domestic terrorism very deliberately. The FBI defines domestic terrorism as violent criminal acts committed by individuals and or groups to further ideological goals stemming from domestic influences. And that shoe fits. And it's something that has seldom been applied to ranchers in the American West who embrace this insurrectionist ideology, but it should be applied, and it is starting to be applied more and more, especially since the January 6th insurrection. Let's start with some of the insurrections with which we're most familiar, those in the recent years. In 2014 in Bunkerville, Nevada, Ammon Bundy staged a standoff and called in militant forces to back him up when the federal government had gathered up his cattle for illegal trespass that had happened over a period of more than 20 years. Bundy had had his grazing permit revoked because the federal government needed to protect the endangered desert tortoise. He fought that in the courts. He was represented by Karen Bud Fallon, who we'll hear about later. And in an unsuccessful appeal to try and restore his grazing permit. And once he failed at that, he kept on running his cattle on public lands without paying any grazing fees for a period of now more than 30 years. The 2%ers or the 3%ers and the Oathkeepers were the two main militant groups in this insurrection. Two of the participants from this insurrection later traveled down to Las Vegas, Nevada, where they entered a shopping mall and killed 2 security guards. So these were very violent extremists. And here is a very famous photo of one of the snipers from the insurrectionists aiming his AR-15 at federal law enforcement. And law enforcement had actually gathered the cattle into cattle trucks and were ready to drive away when they gave up and gave in and released the cattle and gave these ranchers the victory that they craved. And by doing this, they set in motion a narrative that if you rise up in an armed insurrection against the federal government will back off and you'll get away with it. And that's going to redound to the federal government's discredit and to the federal government's woe over the years that followed. The next one up was in May 2014 in Recapture Canyon, Utah. And this was a fight over what's called an RS-2477 claim, where the counties claim under a statute that expired in 1976 that they have the right to maintain an open roadway anywhere that they designate as a highway early on in American history. And this was a trail that was going through a canyon that the BLM had closed to motorized use in order to protect the sensitive archaeological resources and cultural sites of the indigenous peoples in that area. And an illegal ATV caravan was run through Recapture Canyon, and it was led by Phil Lyman, a county commissioner, and it was also attended by Ryan Bundy, who was part of the Bunkerville insurrection. And Commissioner Lyman was jailed briefly and fined more than, or charged more than $86,000 in restitution. That didn't seem to change his mind and his philosophy about this whole enterprise. In another insurrectionist group that I think is worth talking about is the Dwight and Steve Hammond of Hammond Ranches Incorporated. They got their grazing permit revoked in 2014, the same year as the Bunkerville incident. They got their grazing permit revoked because they had engaged in several alleged arson attempts that were, set fires to BLM public lands. But also their insurrectionist ideology goes back along before that. They issued death threats against the Malheur National Wildlife Refuge managers in 1986, in 1988, and again in 1991. And it was all over access to water on the refuge, where they also had a permit to graze, even though it was a National Wildlife Refuge. Ultimately, they were indicted and later convicted and sentenced to 5 years in prison under mandatory minimum sentencing requirements under a domestic terrorism and arson on federal lands law. And they were put in jail. And during the course of this, one of the arsons was alleged to be a cover-up for poaching of mule deer. And so they set fire to the land to cover up the poaching. Other alleged arsons were to improve rangeland forage production for their cattle. And they were also accused of child abuse to silence their child, who was thought to maybe be a risk to talk to the feds about all the illegal doings that they were engaged in. And so there was alleged child abuse involved here as well. They served 3 years of a 5-year sentence. When President Trump came in, he started working with Protect the Harvest through Mike Pence, who, Forrest Lucas, who is the bankroller of Protect the Harvest, also was a major Pence funder in terms of campaign funding and ally. And they were released from prison after only 3 years by presidential pardon and flown back to Oregon on a private jet belonging to Forrest Lucas, with this celebratory tweet put out by Protect the Harvest to talk about how wonderful it was that these convicted felons got released and are going back to Oregon to resume their normal and customary ways of life. Now, this Hammond arrest triggered the Malheur National Wildlife Refuge uprising of 2016. And pay no attention to the bullets here because I've got a little glitch. But essentially, it was Ammon Bundy and Ryan Bundy as the ringleaders. Here on the left, you can also see Lavoy Finicum, who was a main spokesperson for the insurrection. They armed themselves heavily. They moved into a closed wildlife refuge headquarters during the middle of the winter and took over. And they commandeered local bulldozers and bulldozed some of the federal lands. They went down into the basement and started monkeying around with indigenous artifacts. And they held regular press conferences to talk about how wonderful it was that they were rising up against the federal oppressors, and also what an injustice it was that Dwight and Steve Hammond had been jailed for their roles in arson on federal lands. And this insurrection dragged on for more than 1 month. It was handled with kid gloves by the FBI and other federal law enforcement. They surrounded the encampment but did not make any moves to evict them. And in the end, while many charges were issued, the ringleaders only got a conspiracy charge, and it was a botched prosecution. And they ended up getting off the hook, and that sent another message that you can get away with this. At about the same time, in Sugar Pine Mine, Oregon, which was a remote prospecting site, there was an unpatented mining claim and unpermitted mining by folks that were up there that were mineral claimants. They called in the Oathkeepers, which is one of these armed militant groups, and had a standoff with the BLM at that same time. So it wasn't just the ranchers that were doing this in Malheur. At that same time, there were mining-related insurrectionists at the same time elsewhere in Oregon. Let's now go back to the origins and where this all began. And it all began with what's called the Sagebrush Rebellion, and it has its roots in the 1940s. And this was a direct reaction to the Taylor Grazing Act. And one of the things that's poorly appreciated is that the Taylor Grazing Act was actually pushed for by the ranching community itself. And the idea was that if we can require the people who are out there grazing on federal public lands to own base property, in other words, to be landowners that had their own home ranch, then we can push off these Basque tramp herders that owned vast herds of sheep that went traveling around, that migrated, that camped with their sheep and grazed on the public lands for free. And this was part of the big range wars in the 1800s and on into the 1900s. And in 1911, indeed, the Rock Springs Grazing Association filed a federal suit to try and get rid of these tramp herders. And ultimately, that fed into the Taylor Grazing Act. One of the requirements of the Taylor Grazing Act is you have to own base property. So when it was passed, the Basque tramp herders were instantly out of business and had to leave the public lands, and the ranchers that were landowners had freed up the land for their own use. In the 1940s, it was called the Great Land Grab, these efforts to actually impose grazing permits on public lands. This festered on for many, many years. In the late 1970s, there was Sagebrush Rebellion legislation that was brought forward by many of the western states that would seek to not to privatize the public land, but to bring them into state ownership. So instead of having the federal government, we'd have the state government. And this was a very deliberate difference and distinction that the ranchers were pushing. So instead of privatizing the land and having to pay taxes on it, you move it into state government. The ranchers felt like they could control the state legislatures, and largely that's been true. So they felt like they could get the same sweetheart deal without the heavy, jackbooted approach of the federal government, which might actually manage their grazing operations to some degree or another. In 1980, Ronald Reagan, while he was running for the presidency, declares, "I am a sagebrush rebel," and he puts a real national political imprimatur on this movement. And subsequently, he puts James Watt in charge of the Interior Department, and from the Mountain States Legal Foundation, with real sympathies for this movement. Now, back in the early 1990s, or in the 1980s, the Clump family was one of these early insurrectionist ranching families, and they're from southeastern Arizona. And in the 1980s, they were charged with criminal misdemeanors for padlocking gates and blocking public access to 47,000 acres of federal public land in Arizona. In 1992, the BLM had a roundup of their cattle after their grazing permit was revoked, and they seized and sold at auction 84 of the Clump family's cows. And there was a great deal of litigation that then ensued, where the judge finally ruled in 2002 that the Clump family repeatedly and willfully trespassed their livestock on public lands on 2 allotments, and Wally Clump served 1 year in prison for trespass. Ultimately, Wally Clump told the New York Times, "You take those cows, I'll kill you, as mandated by the Second Amendment." So this is a definite kind of tendency towards violence that is a precursor for what we would see in the coming decades. And the Clumps ultimately lost and their grazing permits, some of the grazing permits were retained, and they are fighting to get those permits back even now. In the early 1990s, there were a number of bombings that were targeting federal officials and designed to actively terrorize them. In 1995, there were 2 bombs that targeted Humboldt-Toyabe National Forest properties. There was, in 1995, the head of the California Forestry Association, a timber industry association, was bombed. That turned out to be the Unabomber, so it was unrelated. But then in August 1995, a bomb destroyed the van of District Ranger Guy Pence in front of his home. And his family, the Guy Pence was out of town. His wife and kids were in the living room watching a movie. They happened to get up to go in and get some popcorn, and the van blew up, exploding the front window of their home. And they were just very fortunate to have not happened to be in that room at that moment, or they might have been seriously injured or even killed. I ended up talking to Gloria Fora, who was the Humboldt-Toyabe National Forest supervisor that came on just after these bombings. And she told me that the terror was very real, that the Department of Justice told her that they should not send any crimes if the perpetrator was a Nevada resident, if they were over 65, because they wouldn't prosecute them, because the judges and juries wouldn't convict them. And so there was a definite flavor of lawlessness, a definite flavor of intimidation. One of her district rangers was told, "If you don't get out of town, we're going to burn down your home." She didn't stay. She got out of town. So the terror was real, and it was very much a part of the federal reality if you're a federal official. And so now you can understand a little bit some of the intimidation that the livestock community is directing at these federal officials. And there were a number of other pipe bombings that were attempted or carried through later. So, and some of them were unrelated to the ranching industry. So this was part of a whole flavor of the times. And there were a number of other incidents that were unrelated to public lands ranching during this period. We had the October 1983 attempted bombing of the Oklahoma City Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building. There was 1992, the Ruby Ridge standoff in Idaho over gun violations that ended up with the two members of the Weaver family and one deputy marshal killed. There was a 1993 standoff of the Branch Davidian compound in Waco where the Branch Davidians ultimately decided to set fire to their own compound and immolate themselves, causing a lot of controversy. And that led directly to Timothy McVeigh and Terry Nichols bombing the second bombing attempt, which was successful, of the Alfred P. Murrah building in Oklahoma City, which killed 168 people and is one of the most deadly domestic terrorism events in the United States. In 1997, some insurrectionists declared themselves to be the Republic of Texas and seceded from the United States, took hostages, and created an embassy, and there was an armed standoff that ultimately ended in a shootout where one of the militants was killed. And in August 2017, the famous Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, Virginia, which was a reaction to social justice movements that ended up with one counter-protester being killed. So there have been a lot of insurrectionist incidents throughout the United States that really I think are related to the domestic terrorism that went on in the West involving the ranchers, because the lesson that's been kind of taken is that you can get violent, you can be armed, and you can get away with it. There was the Jefferson County bulldozer incident in Nevada, where Dick Carver bulldozed a road into a Forest Service closed area, ultimately billed for $82,000 in damage. There was the Jarbidge Wilderness Shovel Brigade, where we had Wayne Hage, a very prominent rancher, leading an effort to reopen closed roads and remove bulldozers into an area that had been closed to protect bull trout habitat. And this incident and the failure of the United States Department of Justice and the Forest Service to back up the Gloria Fora in her capacity as regional forester led to her resignation under protest, because we would not do anything as a federal government to address and hold to account the insurrectionists in this incident. Frank Robbins in Wyoming engaged in a long battle with federal agencies over his grazing permits. Ultimately, he padlocked a bunch of roads to block the BLM from accessing federal public land. In 1998, he filed a racketeering and corrupt organizations lawsuit against the agency. That would allow him to go after the officials personally and criminally, and that went ultimately to the Supreme Court. Karen Bud Fallon was the attorney on that. So we hear from her again. And this Frank Robbins has long been blackmailing the Game and Fish Department over their payments of livestock, and so he's another insurrectionist in the constellation, showing the geographic breadth of this movement. In Utah here, we have the Monroe Mountain Ranchers. On the far right, you have Stanton Gleam, who was at Bunkerville and one of the insurrectionists there. They had their livestock permits on the Fish Lake National Forest reduced by 50% to restore land health. And that led to a long-running series of threats. At one point, the Piute County Sheriff, who was a cousin of Stanton Gleave and also a signatory to the Constitutional Sheriffs and Peace Officers Association, which is an insurrectionist law enforcement group, threatened to arrest Forest Service personnel for doing their job. So this is part of the story as well. And in 2016, right around the time of the Malheur incident, The Stanton Gleave here at the far right was one of the ranchers who threatened to burn or tear up their grazing permits and just basically go rogue and say, we don't need any federal management of law enforcement. And it wasn't just, this spread then into the broader populace. So in 2020, there were protests over the killing of George Floyd all around the country, and this triggered what's called the Boogaloo movement. It was named after the movie Breakdancing 2 Electric Boogaloo, which is a sort of a dog whistle to the Civil War. It's like, let's have a second Civil War. This is in Laramie, Wyoming, my hometown. So these were the types of people who were showing up with Montana license plates and AR-15s to try and intimidate the protesters there. Later on, Ammon Bundy engaged in COVID-19 protests, wouldn't wear a mask in the state capitol, got hauled off in a chair in handcuffs, and he is now creating a movement called People's Rights, who's trying to raise an army. It's called informally Ammon's Army. There are a lot of crackpot legal theories that I won't go into in depth. Take a screenshot here if you'd like. But basically the idea is that the federal government doesn't have any right to regulate ranching, doesn't have any right to own land in the West, and or that ranchers have the right to graze their cattle wherever they want. And these have been tested by the courts, and the ranchers lose every time. And finally, this is Hank Vogler, who is a grazing permittee in Northeast Nevada right now. He's just gotten his grazing permit suspended for a year for illegally trespassing on another permittee's allotment. And he is going through the same process now. This is the face of ranching in the American West. There's a saying that says, and I'll paraphrase, that the drunk person says what the sober person thinks. These radicals that are speaking and acting out on these insurrectionist ideas are holding philosophies that are pretty broadly held in the public lands ranching community. It's just these are the guys that are foolish enough or brash enough to say something about it. So essentially, I want to now go on to note that some of these folks are running for political office, and so they hate the government, but they want to become the government. So both Ammon and Ryan Bundy have or are currently running for governor. Phil Lyman actually won as a legislator, and Hank Vogler is running for county commissioner. So this is the future that they're hoping to create. And now let's go to the next presentation.